Everyone, I'm back again. I think you're really going to like this episode. I'm introducing someone that I have looked up to for a while, Dr. Sven Steinmo, who's a political scientist who recently retired. What I think you'll like about this episode is we talk deeply about Dr. Steinmo's background and the way that he moved from blue collar work into a long and really successful academic career. Steinmo has published probably 5 books and has 2 that will be coming out in the coming years. The Evolution of Modern States, which has been cited many times, Taxation and Democracy, Growing Apart, Willing to Pay. His PhD thesis was titled The Mobilization of Bias, and it won the American Political Science Association's Gabriel Almond Award for Best PhD Thesis in Comparative Politics in 1989. As I said, his first book, Taxation and Democracy, won the American Political Science Association's William Riker Award for Best Book in the Political Economy in 1994. His book, The Evolution of the Modern State, won the Gunnar Myrdal Award for the best book on evolutionary political economy by the European Association of Evolutionary Theory in 2011. And Dr. Steinmo has also been a visiting professor at over 12 universities, some of which are the University of Oxford, the University of Tokyo, the Max Planck Institute, University of Gothenburg in Sweden, the European University Institute, the Copenhagen School of Business, the Schumann Center for Advanced Research, and many other places. And it probably has over 30,000 citations. I met him because I was taking his Intro to Comparative Politics class while I was studying political science at the University of Colorado. And I was fascinated by his perspective just because he has like a very unique way of looking at the kind of formation of the nation in America. And then also his perspectives on a category that he created, you'll hear more about, historical institutionalism, and the relevant applications for evolutionary theory in the political science. So he's actually going to be a regular contributor. So I'm excited for you to get to know a little bit more about Dr. Steinmo. I'm actually really excited to host you because this has been building up for a while from me taking your comparative politics class about 2 years ago, all the way to seeking to collaborate with you as a political science student, but a aspiring political practitioner. So I'm formally...
It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you, Steinmo. It's an honor to host you. And in this conversation that we're holding today, I plan to more formally introduce you, but then also give people a better idea of like why I'm captivated by your work and research and contributions to political science and why I think they're important heading into this election year. For everyone that's wondering like what we're working on, what Dr. Steinmo and I are working on, we're actually putting together a multi-part series where we're going to host some really cool debates I'll moderate. And you, Dr. Steinmo, and a couple of your colleagues are going to join us. We're also going to put some collaborative writing. To be honest, Dr. Steinmo, I think you have a fascinating background, and I think people might think academic or Boulder, Berkeley, Santa Clara. They might think liberal. Santa Cruz, I'm sorry, not Santa Clara. But they might think liberal, but I think it's a little bit harder to place your politics because you kind of read between the lines. And your perspective is very direct in a lot of ways, but maybe we could just start like, how did you even end up in academia? And, what was the trajectory there?
Well, it's a bit unusual, I guess. So how did I get in academia? Well, I was a classic 1970s kind of hippie kid. Um, and I, uh, 17 years old in 1969, I didn't want to go to Vietnam.
Okay.
So I am a Norwegian citizen. I was born 2 months after I got here. My parents got here, and I had the option to go to Norway when I was 17. So I moved to Norway, and eventually started, came back to America, but kept my connection there. In the summers, I would go back to Norway because at that time I could make much more money working in the summers in Norway, um, and did that for a while. Then, after I graduated from college, I went to UC Santa Cruz. I'm a banana slug. Um,
Okay.
Story behind that as well. My roommates and I invented the mascot, the banana slug, for our soccer team. That's a
Oh,
true story.
cool.
It really is
Okay.
a true story. At any rate, I decided to travel around, go back to Europe again, and my girlfriend, now wife, and I went there and traveled for 7, 8, 9 months, and then ran out of money. Went back to Norway and got a job working in the oil fields, uh, in offshore oil. I went to Santa Cruz, as I said, which had no grades. And I therefore I thought I'd always go to law school. I would
Mhm.
never, um, unfortunately, I'm dyslexic. And when I take the LSAT tests, I would always score in the bottom 20%,
Oh,
which meant I wasn't going to go to law school.
sure.
I got, honors and all of that from my professors liked me enough. So I decided from the oil platform, I literally applied, had a secretary type it for me, um, to go to graduate school at Berkeley. At the time, Berkeley was under some pressure for diversity because it was the top graduate program in the country. And they were under some pressure for diversity, which meant, for them, basically they had all, basically Harvard and Princeton and Stanford people there, all white males. And they decided that the chair of the department, this I've heard subsequently from somebody in this committee, said, "We got an applicant from an oil worker? Now that's
Okay.
diverse."
Sure.
Uh, so Berkeley had a program where you come in for the master's degree, and if you do well, they would invite you back for the PhD program. So they said, "What the hell? Let them in." So I
Sure.
got into the master's, and that started my political science master's. I wrote a paper for a colleague, or for I'm sorry, now colleague, um, named David Leonard, on healthcare reform. And he said, "This is really, really interesting. You should take it over to the public health school," because it was about, yeah. And I did. And one of the Henrik Blum was the professor there. He read and he said, "This is really interesting. You should go get a degree in public health." So, and they paid me for 2 years, to get a degree in public health. So I have an MPH in health policy and planning. Uh, and I was going to be a health planner. Unfortunately, Ronald Reagan got elected in 1980. And Ronald Reagan's the only federal government bureaucracy that was totally eliminated from his first budget was health planning. And I was
Jeez.
getting a master's in health planning.
Ah, terrible timing.
Yeah, well, yes. Um,
It worked out.
yeah, it worked out. There were lots of really, really senior people and really smart people. It was a wonderful field, and I'm so sorry that we need health planning in this country, by the way. But So I went back to graduate program in political science, and um, that's what got. I mean, then I was fascinated. My honors thesis in Santa Cruz was on why the United States doesn't have a national health insurance system, and I compared Sweden and the United States, and basically I made what would be a cultural argument that was about our culture, we're individualists, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so as I finished my exams and all of that, I was trying to figure out what to do a what I was going to do my PhD thesis on, and I decided to do it on why the United States doesn't have a national health insurance system. Unfortunately, I got no funding because who the hell is this guy? But what did happen was that I went to my professor, Aaron Wildavsky, a very, very famous political scientist, and he said, well, I'm going to work on a book on the history of taxation. And I'd like you to write a chapter for my book, or do the research and more. Anyway, on the 20th century, and so the OECD was coming out with data on tax systems and so on, and I did this, and he quite liked what I wrote for him, and was basically funded me for a year. And then I thought, if I'm interested in why the United States doesn't have a national health insurance system, one of the things I discovered in the process of my research on tax policy was that the United States actually had one of the most progressive tax systems in the world, which blew me away. And nobody had ever actually done comparative tax policy analysis before. And I thought, well, then why don't I, if I'm interested in why America is different, and I can't get funding for health insurance, so I wrote applications for basically saying, did you know the United States has a very progressive tax system compared to even Sweden, and I want to figure out why. And I went from zero to hero. I got every single grant I applied for.
Wow. Okay.
And in fact, it was this is a side note here. I literally got every grant, and I got hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants for PhD research. It's just, but all of the grants have a clause in: if you get funding from somewhere else, we decline this funding.
Okay. It must have struck a chord.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it was so. It was right. As some would tell you, some people get funding because they're so famous. And occasionally some people get funding because the question or the puzzle is so interesting. I was the latter, right?
Okay.
Remember, yes. I'm an oil worker.
Yes.
And what Aaron Wildavsky did is he called all the funders and said, this is ridiculous. And they basically divide. So I got funding for 2.5 years to do this research. I then went off to Sweden and Britain to do the research. I was there, had children while I was there with my wife. And I started with the culturalist argument, but I couldn't make it work. I couldn't figure out if it's culture. Well, we're the individualists, right? So how does that make sense? And actually, there was a moment of true inspiration that I got from, I was interviewing a congressional staffer for the House Ways and Means Committee in Washington. And I said to him, all the countries in Europe have figured out that you need a value-added tax to raise enough money to do the things that we, progressives want, like health insurance for everybody and other things. And he said the most obvious thing in the world, like you've got to be a PhD student for not seeing something so obvious. He said, this is in Sweden.
Okay.
Yeah. Said, yeah, but here, if we agreed on the left, or the Democrats agreed to value-added tax, which surely would raise a lot of money, what would happen is the next Congress would cut taxes on the rich, and we wouldn't get national health insurance. We would just get a more regressive tax system. And so that led me to think, maybe it's not the culture which explains American weak welfare state, why we have such inequality. Well, the inequality wasn't so high then; it's gotten much worse. But it is our institutions. That is, the great structure and character of our institutions mean that even when somebody is elected a president is elected to do something very like create national health insurance, there have been 4 presidents who ran on the campaign and won, starting with Truman. He did the whistle stop tour and promising national health insurance. And that's how he beat Dewey, because people wanted national health insurance. But unfortunately, he got into office, and this happened to Carter, and even Nixon wanted it. Obviously, Clinton wanted it. Every time it happens, the Congress says, nope, you heard about the checks and balances? Nope, we're not doing it. So the staffer was right at one level. If we had a regressive tax that raised a lot of money, like a value added tax, it's a question of how regressive it is, but it's a different question. Um, how could they guarantee that it wouldn't be used, the spending wouldn't be used to buy more B-1 bombers?
Yeah,
The answer
exactly.
is you can't promise that. Not in the
Okay.
American system of checks and balances and a system which gives so much power to powerful interest groups.
It's the
That's
institution, stupid.
it's then I wrote, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Paper called
Okay.
Institution Stupid.
Okay. And I read this paper, and I guess I must have read some of your earlier papers too when you described your experience in Washington, D.C. and seeing these things play out in real time, uh, which I'm sure in a lot of ways is maybe seems trivial now, but was probably baffling. Like we can't make good decisions because our institutions are set up in a certain way. And oh, go ahead.
Well, let me give you another little anecdote that fits into this story, the previous story.
Sure.
On my trip with my then girlfriend, now wife, to Europe, we took a bus across the country, $99 Greyhound bus, stopped in lots of places. And while we were in Washington visiting a friend, and Cyrus Vance, who was the Secretary of State for Carter, remember Carter was one of those that tried to push a national health insurance bill. Well, his big plan was an energy plan. And I, like most people of my generation, had read Diary for a Small Planet, and there was, the Cuyahoga River was on fire, and there was a real environmental disaster going on in America, and everybody knew it. So Carter put together an energy plan, which had a lot of pieces to it, including ultimately a 50 cent a gallon tax on gasoline, but many things, subsidies for solar energy. He put solar panels on the White House and things like that. And so I went to the opening day of the hearing when Cyrus Vance, it was so important that the Secretary of State introduced it to the Joint Congressional Committee on Energy. And he made a very impassioned speech. And at the end of the speech, it was a big semicircle, wood paneled room, beautiful, all of these senators and congressmen sitting around. And they went down the row like this, boom, 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 boom. And and each one of them said, "Well, Mr. Vance, we very much need an energy plan. America." This is after, the quadrupling of the price of gasoline in America and
Sure.
long lines at the gas pumps and all that. We need to fix, and the environment needs it and everything. But in my district, and then the next one went, "I think this is a great idea. We really need this. It's a super important policy. It's not just for the that we need more energy and different sources. We are destroying our environment." But in my district, and by
Yeah.
the time it went halfway across the room, it was obvious it was going nowhere.
Yeah.
So everybody supported it, but everybody had a constituent that either drove a car, made a car, or pumped gas
Sure.
or pumped oil. And we still don't have an energy plan. And that was 40 some years ago.
Yeah, and it's crazy too with all the environmental politics that are being practiced today. My generation thinks they invented that stuff, and
Ah,
like you pointed out, a lot of this stuff started in this, evolved dramatically in the '60s and '70s,
that's right.
'80s, um,
It's,
and then
it's, it's,
it's been passed down.
it's an issue like national health insurance, which the majority of Americans have favored since Truman.
Okay.
The majority of Americans think we ought to have a reasonable health plan. Current politics today, everybody thinks we need to have a reasonable immigration policy. Why don't we? Because of
Yeah.
the character and structure of the Republicans won't agree with the Democrats because they're going to beat them up with it in the next election, they hope. And
Right.
the Democrats can't concede to the Republicans because then they've handed them the issue. So it's not going to happen. We're not going to solve the immigrant crisis or the energy crisis or the healthcare crisis. And it's not because nobody wants it.
It's the institutions.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so this brings me to the next point here, Dr. Steinmo, is that you actually contributed to the emergence of a subfield or subcategory of political science called historical institutionalism. I don't think I've ever asked you this before, but like,
How did that happen? And, what has been the result of creating that subcategory for research and just society in general, if anything?
Well, it happened I was finishing my PhD thesis, or just about finished with it. And I went to American Political Science annual convention, and it was on tax, this comparative tax policy. And I went to several panels, and I saw there were a group of other young scholars that were making policy arguments. Historically, in American political science, if you studied comparative politics, what that meant is that you studied another country than America. You didn't actually
Sure.
compare. So you studied, labor policy in Peru, or
Oh,
French healthcare or whatever, and that was called comparative politics.
interesting.
But there was a small group of people of young people that were actually trying to look at questions like, why does why is Sweden? One of my colleagues that I ran into at this conference, I didn't know any of these people, was writing a paper on why Sweden had such high levels of unionization. And
Okay.
he was making an argument. He was kind of a Marxist, but he was making, because there's institutions were there. And so I had this idea of putting together a small conference here at Boulder, Colorado, and which I raised a little bit of money and invited these other young, basically policy people who were doing comparative work. And then I had a brilliant idea, what I think was a brilliant idea, probably the only one I've ever had. But then I invited some really famous political scientists, Theda Skocpol, Peter Katz. If any of you are political scientists out there, these are famous people: Theda Skocpol, Peter Katzenstein, Peter Hall, um, um, Doug Ashford, and I invited them to come. And at first, the idea was that they would comment on the papers. And my really brilliant idea is I had them present the young people's papers, because none of them had PhDs, including myself, or maybe just got a PhD. And what that did is that forced a very different kind of conversation than you normally have in an academic conference. An academic conference normally is people get in front, they're scared to death, especially if they're young, and they're trying to,
Sure.
they're trying to prove it, and they've only got 5 minutes, and it's usually horrible. But
Sure.
what this did is it made the senior people think about what we were all doing in the ether. Um, this idea of, like, we're all talking about institutions here, and why this country does different from that country, and etc. And I believe it was Theda Skocpol who turned to me and said, "Sven, you got to do a book on this."
Okay.
And in that, I recruited a colleague, Kathy Thielen, who was there just as an observer because she had been a friend in graduate school. She was a Marxist at the time, um, and but she also became persuaded. Wow, institutions are important. So we ended up editing a book called "Structuring Politics." I think it's right here. Very proud of this. Um, and we put together several of the papers, or almost all of them, and um, it became. We came up with the term, or we came up with the term historical institution, because it's institutional. But at that time, there were economists who were writing about the role of institutions. But economists have these narrow-minded, oh, people follow rules, and if you have rules,
Yeah.
and what historical institutional meant is the history builds the rules, and the rules can change with the history. And um, and so we were trying to understand both the outcomes, but the origins of that outcomes. It's not a simple algebraic question. You balance the pluses and minuses and do cost benefit analysis. And if I get more benefits from doing X than Y, I will do X. That's the way economists think, or at least used to think. Um, and instead trying to blend in the role of ideas and the what I ultimately come to argue is the evolution of institutions.
Okay. And in terms of like, so at one point, comparative politics was studying other
That's right. It's
countries
still most,
outside of the U.S.
It still mostly is.
Okay. But so when you're applying this kind of thinking in historical institutionalism, like what is the process, or like what is the basis for, like, I need to draw on historical institutionalism to think about two countries' institutions or the evolution, like,
Well, okay, so in my view, historical institutionalism is not a theory. It is not something that it's not like rational choice theory, which is very simple. Oh, here's how I'm going to explain, and you go look for cases, right? And that's unfortunately what all too much of political science has become. It's like, oh, I've got an idea, I've got a theory, and I'm going to go look for examples of my theory. I think that's bad science. Um, Historical institutionalism is much more of what I would call an approach. So you start with a question or a puzzle. Why do we find this outcome? And it doesn't have to be comparative. It can be, like my current book, it's about America. But why do we find this? And then you test alternative explanations. It could be just raw self-interest is the best explanation for outcome X. But an historical institutionalist approach would be to look at how do the institutions shape people's understandings of both their interest and their beliefs about what's the right thing to do, right?
yeah,
I don't believe, and I don't think very many thoughtful people believe that people are truly self-interested son of a bitches who only care about what's in their self-interest. I mean, some
right,
do, but they're all economists.
yeah.
But most people, and even most economists, really truly understand that we have a lot of things that motivate us. So then you would look to if institutions are part of the turn out to be part of the explanation for why people chose A, B, or C in a simple choice structure. How did the institutions shape that, both in terms of what they believe is valuable, or their ideas and their values, as well as their self-interest? It doesn't take interest out of the story. It is
Sure.
part of the story, but it's not the whole of the story.
Right. And like you said, it's adding some additional dimensions to the analysis, like ideas and values.
Exactly.
And then,
And it's important because obviously it's much simpler. If we could explain all outcomes um, as a simple billiard ball game, then, you certainly wouldn't need social scientists. And I do think you do need social scientists.
I
But
agree. And oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
The historical institutionalist school is still going to look for like dramatic events that happen in a society, or like big events that occur.
Clearly, it was what we call critical junctures. In other words, it's
Okay.
very obvious that under, so let's say, normal times or normal politics or whatever, people, the institutions are relatively stable, but there are moments uh, and or critical junctures in which things change dramatically. The creation of the New Deal in America, for example, that's an easy one, right? But there are lots of those, and there are some larger and smaller ones, but in which people actually rethink the institutions.
Okay.
Um, we may be in one of those right now. I think there are many Americans that are rethinking our system, and they, attack the Capitol because they think the system's screwed. They
Sure.
may change it, and if they elect a new president, maybe they will.
Sure. So, Dr. Steinmo, if I'm listening to a international or a political economist at Cambridge say that they're using historical institutionalism for the analysis that they're about to discuss,
Mhm.
then they're using a framework that you came up with, literally.
Well, I mean, I was, I
At least
coined,
the foundation spread,
but
right? Over the,
I no idea comes out of thin air, right?
yeah,
Uh,
of course.
I happened to be in a place, uh, intellectually perhaps, um, that allowed me to pull together a group of people that, in a very real sense, we came up with this
Yeah.
idea.
But the point is, if I'm listening to a political economist say out loud in 2023 they're using historical institutionalism, your group was the kind of foundation of introducing that way of looking at politics, economics, political economy.
Yeah, that's why Structuring Politics has thousands and thousands and thousands of citations.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just wanted to make this clear as to like why it's not just that you created that category, but it's like that's a kind of impact that your work has had. You're going to downplay it because you're an educator, and you know that nobody has all the answers better than some of us that aren't, asking these complex questions and holding space to try to find answers over, multiple decades. But I just think that is brilliant in a lot of ways because, I'm like, I do a lot of my own analysis in my professional work, but then also like when I'm studying, I try to do my own kind of exercises, analyzing. So anytime I see like a new framework or a heuristic, I can imagine that brings opportunity for new knowledge to form or new angles, which even that could have an impact on the institutions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay.
And part of so again, I try to say this is an approach and not a theory.
Got it.
And I mean, a theory is, a very direct relation with means and causes and means and ends. And this is more a way of thinking and studying our political and indeed our social world. And it is specifically because I try to bring in the role of ideas as well as the role of interest. It's messy,
Sure.
it's not the kind of you can't say if it's you have A plus B is going to equal C. And you know what? The world is messy. History is messy. Could
It
you have
is.
predicted Oppenheimer's ability to get the bomb before the Germans did? And what would have happened if the Germans got the bomb before the US did? There's actually a TV series on that. Pretty scary.
It
It
is.
could have.
And, maybe like on the more contentious side of things, there's definitely like a pre and post America around 9/11.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
that event's had a tremendous impact on the institution. So now, 23 years later, I could use historical institutionalism to peg that event and start to ask questions about like how has history shaped these institutions in the last, say, 20 years. How has the institution morphed? Are there new actors engaging with it?
So 9/11 happens, and the Wolfowitz and Cheney had long been fearful of what would happen to it for Israel, and they thought that Iraq was the most liberal, and they were correct. Iraq was the most liberal Arab state, most advanced, had oil, etc. And they thought if we can just make Iraq a democracy, because it's ready, it's got more women's rights and so on. All we got to do is get rid of this guy, Saddam Hussein. So let's use the 9/11 event to attack Iraq.
Yeah.
And of course, it didn't turn out like they had hoped.
Okay, now I love your takes on like when you're writing or when we're just having conversations, hanging out. One of the topics that has come up is the idea that we're in this current situation, which we agree is messy, and the United States is basically not sure if it can run a legitimate election. I didn't know that I would be alive for this moment. So we're not sure if we can run a legitimate election. And you came out and claimed Trump's not to blame. Like, could you tell us more about like why Trump is not to blame? I know it's contrarian perspective.
I'm not arguing that I like Trump or that I will vote for him, to be clear, right?
Sure.
But my argument, it starts with a prior question. Why Trump? Right? There are plenty of narcissists out there. There's even plenty of rich billionaire narcissists out there. Why has he been so successful? And I think the answer to that, or a part of the answer to that, is that Americans, so many middle class or working class white Americans in particular, are angry as hell at their political system. So my argument is that it's the political system or the institutions that are to blame for the rise of a Donald Trump. There are so many things that politicians have promised, and the only thing that Americans are certain of is the politicians won't do what they promise.
Sure.
Donald Trump, now mind you, you could say he didn't do everything he promised too, but Donald Trump speaks very directly to people, and he speaks to the fears and anger of white, middle, working class Americans.
Yeah.
Who do feel pushed aside and who do feel that there is an elite that governs and doesn't listen to them, and
Right.
And they're right, they don't.
Okay. Let's talk about why they're right. And maybe it's not just the white working class Americans that have these grievances that Trump's attached himself to, right? But like, why do you think they're right? What's happening in our system, our institutions, that allowed for? Are we talking about like the distance between like values and ideas and reality?
Well, I am writing a book on this exact subject, and so it's really difficult to give a very quick, easy answer to that. But I'll
Of course.
make a run at it.
Okay.
Our political system was founded by an elite, a very small elite, who were scared shitless of average Americans, the people who fought the Revolutionary War for them. At the end of the Revolutionary War, the elite went, holy shit, those people took these things in the Declaration of Independence seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, they think all men are created equal, and that you can't tax without representation. Whoa! We wanted to be in the House of Commons. We didn't mean shoemakers should have a right to participate in politics. Those people are scum. What are the checks and balances? They are checks on the democratic will of the people. Very clear.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't want the average citizen to have power in government. They fought the Revolutionary War because these guys were mostly property investors and slave owners. They were worried that the British would take away their right to property, i.e. slaves. And they put the line of proclamation, so they stopped the speculation on new land, which is how most of these people got wealthy. The richest man in America was George Washington as a land speculator. And most of them were not all of them, but most of them were quite wealthy. They created a system that was designed to be dysfunctional.
Okay. And so
now, that's okay as long as you have a giant continent that all you have to do is kill lots of Indians. And then let Europeans come in. And we did practice genocide, practice ethnic cleansing.
Right.
And the 3 million Americans, the white Americans on the eastern seaboard, expanded across the richest piece of real estate in the world. And frankly, all you needed government for was to clear the land. But by the 20th century, the industrialization and complexity and so on leads to people asking the government to do things for them, like environmental regulations, like health regulations, like
labor protections.
And the elite says, holy shit, we didn't need. And the checks and balances are designed to make sure that the average citizen doesn't get what the average citizen wants.
Yeah. Wow. And okay. And so for just, somebody like me, for example, like how I always thought about checks and balances growing up was checks and balances on legislative, executive, judicial branches of government. But I didn't realize that the checks and balances in more realistic terms were designed to limit who could ascend to power, how much pressure individual citizens could put on institutions,
right.
Who could have influence.
Designed very specifically. They were scared that you've heard probably from high school or college, the Shays Rebellion. That was one of many rebellions of small farmers basically rebelling against the taxes that were imposed on them or by the elites. And they said, wait a minute, didn't we fight a revolution about this? And
Yeah.
so Governor Morris hired 4,000 mercenaries, quite literally, to put it down. And that's the beginnings of what eventually brought on the Constitutional Convention, which was many years after the Revolutionary War. And of course, to be sure, there, people at the convention and many elites were what we would call, you and I would think of as Democrats, in the sense that they really did. It's not clear that, people like Jefferson probably really did believe in what we think of as democracy. Very clear that people like Hamilton, for example, did not. But those you could say maybe the extremes. But so it's the eventual document that came out was one that was a set of compromises, which underlying those institutions is this profound American belief in equality. I mean, the Declaration of Independence, right? And all men are created equal. But it's not really what they believed. And if you read their writings, they were pretty clear about it. They did not believe all men were created equal. And I'm not talking about the fact that blacks were not even considered humans or women. Well, so, but those ideas are still part of and in fact, those ideas, this is part of, back to kind of historical institutionalists, those ideas are still with us. Most Americans on the right as well as the left truly believe that we should have a society of greater equality. Very, very few people agree with or want the kind of inequality that has come in America. I mean, the homelessness is the most obvious current example, but
Sure.
even, I mean, and there are some absurd, white nationalist racists in America. But
Sure.
that's really a small segment of America, really small segment of America. Most right-wing MAGA supporters want a more equal society. They think
Sure.
it's not equal because the elite governs so profoundly.
Yeah. And we're seeing like a very strong reaction in the body of politics, right? Everyone has their own example right now as they're listening to this of, one of
Yes.
those strong reactions in a number of institutions, right? So it's boiled out of Washington and it's spreading around the country.
Yes. And the left and the progressive left has a similar kind of argument. The degree of anger and frustration with our political system is just as prevalent and profound on the left as it is on the right.
So to some degree, you could still argue that whatever formed that cluster of people in the Northeast and the kind of westward expansion, without making a moral argument, was profound. I'm sitting here in Chicago. You're in Boulder. We're west of where we started 300 or 400 years ago. So we can argue that is profound and to a degree exceptional.
Right. It is exceptional.
But so now what we're grappling with is we created these values that were interpreted through political thinkers inside of the institutions, through the actions of citizens and politicians that said, we want a broader set of rights. We want more protections from our government. We want to be treated equal. And so you're saying this is why Trump is not the problem. It's that these institutions are not delivering what people feel they were promised or what they've been taught to believe.
Well, Trump is a product of this problem. And he is obviously extremely creative man and extremely good at motivating people and finding what they're fearful of, etc. Just think about the difference between the traditional Republican Party and Donald Trump. Now, the Republican Party has become the party of Trump, but the traditional Republican Party is the party of elites, right? In a very, very real sense, he doesn't say this, but he's running. His first victory was against the Republicans, right? And once he did that, then he goes after the the Democratic left, but he had to beat the Republicans first, and he did, by partly because the the primary process that's available in most states now allowed people who are not partisan, often were Democrats, but often very alienated Democrats, partly because of what happened to them with NAFTA and globalization and Clinton, etc. They became more and more angry and frustrated and didn't vote, etc., didn't participate. And then Trump comes along and said, I know what you believe. You believe our system is corrupt. You believe our system, that there are elites out there that are taking advantage of you. And those elites are run by Harvard graduates who are all woke. And I'm not. I want to represent you, the working class, the worker, the American middle, etc. And they went, right on, man.
Yeah.
They didn't vote Republican 20 years earlier.
Right.
In fact, they haven't voted Republican now. They vote Trump.
Yeah. Okay. And again, I'm going to try to tie this back. We were taught values and beliefs, and they were embedded in our institutions. And at some point, the average person didn't feel like those institutions were living up to the promise. You're saying this inability to live up to these promises is baked into the system. And one example is checks and balances, like that idea right there.
I would say the central explanation for the reason it can't build up to politicians' promises is the checks and balances. I mean, think about a weird political system we have. We have the only political system in the world in which you have got 4 institutions who are designed to fight with each other at the national level.
Sure.
Right? And then on top of that, you give control of the electoral process to state governments and whoever happens to control the state government. And on top of that, you give 2 senators to each state. So Wyoming, which I think has 365,000 people, has 2 senators. California, which has 38 million people, has 2 senators. Mm-hmm. So the majority, I mean, and why is that? It's because the southern states, going back to the early Constitution, they weren't going to sign this document if it gave the majority of people the power to take away slavery. So not only did they put slavery in the Constitution, the right to own property, slaves, but they also made sure that the majority of the citizens, which lived in the North and in the Middle Continent, wouldn't be able to impose their will on the Southern slaveholders. And they called it states' rights. Wrote states' rights. States' rights is slave owners' rights.
It's terrible. Our institutions need to be cleaned off. Now, Steinmo, we're going to talk more about why Trump's not to blame leading into this election, because there's so much more to discuss just in your theory, your writing in this area. Something else that I wanted to kind of give the audience to think about, to show the uniqueness of your perspective. So you were explaining to me at one point that you have applied evolutionary theory in political science. Could you break that down a little bit? Like what happened there? How is evolutionary theory relevant in political science?
Well, because of the success of historical institutionalist kind of analysis, there were departments that called themselves, etc. I was, let's say a mucky-muck in political science for a while. But I kept getting confronted by the question you started with. What's your theory? What's your theory? I mean, honestly, it constantly came, what's your theory? If you don't have a theory, you're just telling stories.
Oh, geez.
It's true. I'm telling stories. If they're coherent stories that make sense and explain things, I'm okay with that. But political science has always had a boner for physics. I call it physics envy. So that's kind of what motivated for me. And there's a little anecdote, which is true and even silly. I was in an airport and I saw a book by a guy named Robin Dunbar, who is a psychologist, anthropologist, and a primatologist. I think he has PhDs in all three at Oxford or something like that. Incredibly smart man, called Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language. And I just pulled it off the shelf and started reading it. And I went, whoa, he's got a theory for the evolution of language. And which, of course, brings in, what are, the fact that we have a tongue that's shaped in a particular direction, the ability to develop and what happens in his theory and his argument, which I think is quite well accepted now, our cognitive capacities co-evolved. The prefrontal cortex co-evolved with our ability to articulate symbols with our tongue. And that enabled the construction of communication of complex ideas, which enabled us to build, he doesn't use the word institutions, but agriculture. So Dunbar shows that there was this essentially co-evolution of literally our ability to speak, our cognitive ability, and ultimately our ability to build symbols, which allow us then to build things like farming. Or, imagine, very simple idea now, right? But let's go kill that wildebeest. You go over there and wait with the bow and arrows, and I will scare him to you, right? How could you do that without language? So that kind of went, wait a minute, that there's something like this in how institutions evolve. The ability to do something leads us to be able to think of something new, which allows us to build new institutions, which allows us to change or helps us and change our ideas and our beliefs and understandings. And that then allows us to build very complex institutions, which both frame our way of thinking, but are changeable and malleable. And I think of that as an evolutionary process.
That's fascinating. And what about how would you apply this evolutionary process in a meaningful way or a practical way in political science?
Well, political science is not thrilled by this idea. Most of it
Okay.
isn't, in part because of the legacy of Spencer and the misuse of Darwinian thinking. Because
Sure.
I remember once a paper I wrote and sent to a big journal, World Politics, and got positive reviews. But one of the reviews said, "What would Milosevic do if he read this?" And first off, I thought, Milosevic doesn't read World Politics. But aside from that, you're saying that because a bad guy might take this evolutionary theory and apply it, therefore it shouldn't be published. In other words, there really is, some of the Naziist arguments were very much racist arguments that said our race is better than that race. Darwin does not say this, anything like it, and it's not embedded in evolutionary theory. But there is this knee-jerk reaction amongst many people who don't understand, have never read evolutionary theory. Physicists who also think that evolutionary theory is bullshit because it's malleable. There are some basic keystones to evolutionary theory, which don't apply to all evolution. The evolution of biology or human biology is different from that of the stars, let's say. But stars are probably a bad example. I shouldn't say that really. But evolutionary theory is also kind of an approach, a way of thinking. It is a theory in the more specific sense that there are, repetition, etc. I won't go through the three keystones of it, but and I think they apply. I think it applies to human beings and our interactions. But the more broad point is that what the institutions we build today. I'll take a very specific example. I believe, I'm a little fearful, and I think a lot of people are a little fearful, or a lot fearful, that Trump could get elected.
Sure.
He's already said that he'll be a dictator on day one. He might, and if he does, what does he do will affect not only his own supporters, but the people who don't support him, and he'll change. He's very clearly said that he's going to use the Department of Justice as his own weapon. He might. Now, whether he does or doesn't, I don't know. Maybe the checks and balances will actually stop him.
Sure.
Here's another possible scenario. Let's say the Supreme Court says he can't become president. That's possible. I don't think likely.
Mhm.
I think we're in for a civil war. What kind of institutions do we have when the people who have guns, which is the MAGA voter,
Yeah.
decides that the system is truly corrupt and needs to be taken down? And if you think Trump is going to fold over and say, "Oh, I appointed half those guys.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
going to go along with them. They're fine. I'm going to bow out." Well, I think we are at a critical juncture. You can't predict what will happen. That's part of the point. You can't predict evolution. Evolutionary theory is you can look back and explain what happened. It does not tell you what will happen. Now, a lot of political science, like a lot of economists, want to be predictors, like physicists. Like I said, they got physics envy. You can't predict something as complex as evolution or institutional change.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess apparently the last time there was political violence outside of the DNC was in Chicago in 1954, I believe. And I actually think this will be the next time that there's political violence at the DNC will be this August in Chicago, not just because of Trump, but because of foreign policy and the size of the protests that are continuing to grow and become more dramatic here in Chicago, and I'm sure in other places.
Yep. I remember it wasn't 64, I don't think, but I remember, they called them the Blue Meanies, the Mayor Daley's police force. They were brutal.
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed that. In the coming weeks and months, Dr. Steinmo and I are going to be putting together some joint political writing, commentary, and also I'm going to host a series of debates with him and some of his colleagues in political economy, sociology, and just political science. And I think that you'll find that they're super exciting and interesting. I'd say that Steinmo probably has like a heterodox perspective, but it's still been socialized at the institutional level amongst researchers, academics, and thinkers alike. So expect to see more from him, and expect to be able to get to know him through some of his personal experience, but also through his research. And I think this is a great year to highlight some of his work, bring his perspective and his colleagues' perspective to the forefront, because we are heading into the election. I'm really excited for the additional content that we're going to be recording for you. Hope you enjoy.